Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week, ILV fellows Nafees Alam and Zander Keig are joined by Monica Harris from the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, along with two of her colleagues, Gabe Nadales and Suzannah Alexander. The group unpacks FAIR's recent civil rights complaint against the Council for the Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs. FAIR alleges that the accreditation standards and practices violate the First Amendment and the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment by compelling ideological conformity and creating a hostile educational environment. The conversation expands to include K-12 education and personal and professional experiences with ideological conformity. All agree it will take dedication and patience to alter the course set by many clinical licensure programs and their accrediting agencies.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast. Our episode today is challenging ideological conformity in social work education. We are joined by Monica Harris, Gabriel Nadales, Suzannah Alexander from FAIR, Zander Keig, and myself are also here. I'd love to have each individual introduce themselves and their background and what brings them here. So if you wouldn't mind, Monica, would you go first?
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Executive Director of FAIR for All. We are a non-profit, nonpartisan organization committed to humanity, fairness, and universal equality.
Awesome. Pleasure to have you here. Gabriel?
Hi, my name is Gabriel Nadales. I'm the National Director of Our America, but I also volunteer as the legal coordinator, advocacy coordinator for FAIR.
Awesome. Pleasure having you here. Suzannah?
Yes, I am a former graduate student in counseling at the University of Tennessee, and during my short stint there, experienced the ideological indoctrination firsthand, ran into a lot of problems, came out recognizing that this could not be an isolated situation.
Awesome. We'd love to hear that story over the course of today's conversation, if you're comfortable sharing it. Mm-hmm. Zander, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. I'm Zander Keig, a licensed clinical social worker. I serve on the board of directors for the Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm also the social work coordinator for Pro Social Workers, which is an ASWB approved provider of continuing education units for social workers. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Happy to have you. My name is Nafees. I'm an associate professor of social work at the University of Nebraska. I'm also a senior scholar with Pro Social Workers, a senior advisor with Open Therapy Institute, and advisor with the Institute for Liberal Values. We'll get started right away with our questions here so we don't keep our listeners and viewers waiting. Your organization's complaint against CACREP addresses ideological conformity in counselor education. Are you aware that the Council on Social Work Education, the CSWE, has similar accreditation standards that evaluate students' values and require them to demonstrate specific ideological commitments? Anyone can chime in and answer.
Yeah, I'll get started. I will say that, yes, FAIR is aware that CSWE has similar problematic standards that evaluate students' values and require specific ideological commitments. As I mentioned, FAIR for All is committed to advocating for universal equality, regardless of race, sex, gender, or any other immutable characteristic. So these types of situations are of profound importance to us. So our OCR complaint specifically addresses how CACREP standards require counseling programs to evaluate a student's dispositions, defined to include values and beliefs. So we're concerned about any accrediting body, not just CACREP, but including CSWE, that creates frameworks that enable practices that compel students to adopt specific ideologies, penalize dissenting views, discriminate based on protected characteristics. And I'd like to add that the issues we've identified in the counselor education appear in multiple professions, including other branches of social work. So FAIR believes that professional competency should be evaluated based on skills only and knowledge, not on adherence to particular ideological viewpoints. So just to sum it up, our concern in this regard extends not just to CACREP, but any educational program at a federally funded institution where students face academic consequences for failing to affirm specific ideological beliefs.
Awesome. And anyone can take this question too. Our listeners and viewers are curious to know what were the conditions that existed for FAIR to file the formal complaint against CACREP? Like, what was the backstory there?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say that might be me, because that's kind of how I ended up at FAIR. I'm the Tennessee chapter leader. But it started out when I went back to grad school. I had gotten divorced and I needed to get back in the workforce after having been a stay-at-home parent for 20 years. And the logical extension of, parenting and my interests really lied in psychology, and I didn't want to I didn't want to take the time to get a full PhD to become a psychologist. Counseling was the fastest way to get started and get to work. And I was aware that the fields really, were kind of tended to be a little far on the left, but I was not at all prepared for how far it was, particularly in a Southern university. I went in, they told us that should be a brave space and we would be confronting new ideas and, all sorts of things. And they encouraged us to, be brave in sharing and that sort of thing. And so I was, but it turned out that the things that I was sharing were apparently way too dangerous. One of the things that I offered early on when we were talking about how you could control your reaction during like a therapy session where you were getting really pushed. And I brought in some of the teachings of Buddhism, which I, have learned over many years, where you reduce your sense of identity and try and focus on the other person through the lens of your values. So you're not thinking about yourself and how what they're saying might be hurtful. You're trying to focus on them and what's going on with them. And I was told almost immediately after class by the professor that was that kind of thinking was invalidating to other identities. And in the course of the next 48 hours, I was approached by another professor who hadn't been present, who had heard about that, to be told that, this thinking wasn't okay. And, I also went in and had an appointment with my advisor who told me that, that would have been okay a few years ago, but it's not okay anymore. And I was just like, I couldn't process that. That didn't make any sense to me. I had assumed I must have explained it wrong because, my understanding of psychology is so much of it is based in Buddhism. You have, acceptance and commitment therapy. You've got dialectical behavioral theory, both which, draw heavily from the teaching of Buddhism. We were even going over that in one of our other classes, and this made no sense. So, which is to say, I didn't stop. It's like I just tried to explain it more, which, actually made the problem worse. I'm like, no, you can't, you must be misunderstanding me. You can't really be saying that. That was kind of where I was at. And by the time I realized that they really thought that was somehow wrong and evil, it was way too late. I was really being bullied by the professors. I was mobbed in my small groups class by the students. And I finished up the semester with, all A's, 1 B plus. But then I was told that I would need to take an extra year so that I could learn these ideas. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. I knew that it was wrong. I couldn't really verbalize a lot of what had happened or why it was wrong. I didn't understand how it was that they were thinking about that. But, over the course of those months, I was told that my thinking was too concrete, my thinking was too legalistic, that I was transphobic, never mind that I had marched in the Pride Parade in 2018. None of that was good enough. And it was a very traumatic experience. And as I walked away from the program at the end of that semester. There was no way that I was going to sign up to spend, an additional year out of the workforce and another year in tuition to get this degree. I wasn't going to do it. And looking back on it, I feel like what happened there was really educational malpractice, which is it's a tangent I won't go off on, but I like to. But that's when I started to slowly, as I recovered, it took me, there were a number of weeks where I just sat in my chair with one of those little things that have sand, or you flip over and you watch the sand go down. I mean, it was weeks, just trying to calm down to where I felt like my heart wasn't going to explode. And as I did, I started to look into what I could do. I filed a complaint with the university. I filed a complaint with CACREP. I filed different things trying to, get attention. I called different lawyers. I called the bar in Tennessee, trying to find people who would help me out. And through the course of that journey, I eventually found FAIR. I found different YouTubers and podcasters, and I started to learn what was underlying that philosophy, and some of the things that they had taught us that just seemed really off the wall and wrong to me, like how we're supposed to evaluate clients based on what their race is, whether they're privileged or marginalized, and why we were supposed to broach the topic of race in therapy. Like that's part of the plan. We were taught, that you need to arrange the conversation so that you end up talking about race. And I learned all of that, and in that process, I found FAIR. And when I found FAIR, I also started to do more investigative work, and I started writing and learning more. I wrote my first piece for Minding the Campus about CACREP, and eventually I put together a Substack, and I've been writing consistently about CACREP, about psychology, about what's happening in the universities, and all of the different issues that have come up in that. I've done a lot of investigating in that, and I'm really quite horrified by what I found. And as I went through that, I brought that stuff to FAIR, and I said, have you seen this? Look at this. Is it me? Or is this, is this really crazy? Did people really actually decide that this was a great idea? That was what was mind-boggling for me. And when it reached the point where there was the new executive order on accreditation, I think that one came out in late February. Then I, started to put together that maybe we should do something. And I talked to the social worker, Arnold Cantu, and we were just starting to connect and talk about some of those things. And I presented that to FAIR, and this is where it ended up.
Interesting. So which leads me to the next question, which is, and this is probably going to be yes, but if you wouldn't mind elaborating further, what are some of the similar conditions that exist, if any, in social work education, as was the case with counselor education?
Well, from my point of view, and my research is not as in-depth in social work yet. I haven't gotten to it thoroughly, but I would say that the big thing that is similar is there is the ideological focus, but social work, their accreditation system is a monopoly already. So CACREP is wanting to become a monopoly so that it seems to me, based on what I've read, is that it's based on an idea of ideological purity. They want all of the people who are practicing under the term professional counseling to have the same, they call it body of knowledge. And what that means, you can translate that to their ideology. And social work is already in that situation. They have already secured their monopoly, and they're, I'm not sure if they have been as thorough as entrenching that into the licensing as CACREP is working on, but that seems to be part of what's happening in both of these groups.
Yeah. Gabriel, did you want to chime in as well on this topic? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. The story that Suzannah tells is unfortunately all too common, both in the graduate and the undergraduate level. You have a lot of administrators who think that they know best, and they think that they are trying to push, what do they call it? Opportunity, equality, inclusiveness. But in fact, they're the ones who are often the most divisive. I still remember about 8 years ago in 2015, so 10 years ago, when I was an activist helping out undergraduate students. I was helping a student create an America Club at the University of Colorado Boulder. Now, this student wanted to be very inclusive, to get all Americans come in together, share American culture. That would to talk about like the melting pot of American culture. Really, that's what it came down to. But when we went over to talk to one of the administrators, he said something along the lines of, and now forgive me, this is 10 years ago, but he said, "Oh, I don't know about America Club. That can be a little bit divisive. What about people who aren't American?" Now, I became an American citizen last year. At the time, I wasn't. But I looked at that and I was like, are you serious? America is one of the most inclusive countries in the world. Yet you have administrators who think that you're not inclusive if you don't look at the idea or the definition of how I define inclusiveness. This happens all the time. And, there's actually a case on point which we cited in the letter. It's called Ward Be Polite. It happened at the University of Eastern Michigan. And in this university, it was a counseling a student who filed a lawsuit. She had certain religious beliefs, and then when she was presented a client, and the way to treat this client would have forced her to violate her religious beliefs. So she sought a referral. And she got the referral, but then the university said that, oh well, she was violating the what do they call it, the American Counseling Association policies on discrimination, and they subjected her to an extraneous disciplinary process. She sued. She actually lost at the district court. She had to appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and she won. Basically saying the court, I remember the court said that tolerance is a two-way street. And unfortunately, many of these administrators, they fail to recognize that there are many ways of tolerating people, but we have to be, when we tolerate people, that also means being tolerant of their ideas.
Yeah. Well, Gabriel, first, I want to congratulate you on being a citizen, and to share some of myself as well. The flag behind me, some of my colleagues have said, well, you might want to reconsider having that there because some people consider that to be a hate symbol. And I was like, I'm an immigrant, and this isn't about me, this is about you, but I just quickly, I'm an immigrant to the United States as well. I was born in Libya, grew up in Bangladesh, and we're proud to be here. My family and I were proud to be here. I'm also an American citizen. I don't want to go anywhere else, and I appreciate my heritage. I study my heritage regularly. Otherwise, my mom would be very upset with me. But at the same time, we all appreciate where we are, my family, I mean. And it would appear as though there is tolerance seems to be a one-way street. And I love how you put that tolerance is a two-way street. Love to have Zander chime in as well on this topic, if you would.
Absolutely. Well, a couple of things I wanted to say about what Suzannah was talking about. It reminds me of there's a difference between educating people and indoctrinating people. right? And what you're describing is more of an indoctrination process. This idea of having a body of knowledge, like it makes sense to me. Like the American Bar Association wants all the law schools to be reading the same case law, maybe. Like everybody's getting educated, right? The AMA is doing the same thing with medical schools. The CSWE is doing the same thing with social workers. So we all have a very similar foundation, but then there's, academic freedom, and, so that professors can bring other things in to supplement that. But when that gets used as a way to indoctrinate, right, it's kind of, they can slip it in through the back door, so to speak. I am not an immigrant, but I am first generation. My family came from Mexico, and thank goodness that my grandmother had the foresight to leave all of her 11 siblings behind and come to the United States, and was not really cut off from the family, but she betrayed the family by leaving Mexico, and she sent her 5 boys. My father was the 5th, the youngest, and they all served in the U.S. military. And so my cousins and I are very thankful to have been born here. And I don't understand this idea that the American flag or Americanism is somehow a negative thing. I think it comes from this indoctrination. And the thing about tolerance is that there is within a certain sect of, let's say, left, people on the far left, as we might be able to refer to them, they have studied, or they've been taught in such a way that comes from teachings from the Frankfurt School, and one of them is Herbert Marcuse, and I like to say Marcuse, but it's probably Marcuse, and his article from 1966, or chapter perhaps in a book on repressive tolerance, is something that they've inherited this idea that you don't have to tolerate what you find intolerable. And so this idea that tolerance goes both ways or all ways gets challenged by that. It also gets challenged by the idea that and I remember saying this when I was in my 20s, and I'm a trans man, so I was a young lesbian at the time, and we didn't have same-sex marriage, and we didn't have the right to serve in the military openly, or not openly, but you know what I mean, as a person declared as a homosexual, or adopt children, or hold jobs, or eat in restaurants, or stay in hotels in a lot of places. I remember when people would say, we want tolerance. And I would say, no, that's not good enough. I don't want to be tolerated. And I would get the Southern Poverty Law Center Wall of Tolerance mailings, send us some money. We'll make a brick with your name on the Wall of Tolerance. And I was like, no, more than tolerance. And so I understand the argument for we shouldn't have to tolerate the intolerable, and we shouldn't settle for tolerance. But I think it mistakes thinking that tolerance is like the lowest denominator of coexistence or multiracialism, right? Living in a pluralistic society. In a pluralistic society, the reason I now think tolerance is a high value is because it honors the fact that we coexist, we live in pluralistic communities, and we don't actually agree with each other. We don't like each other. We wouldn't have each other over for tea. We don't worship in the same places. We might even be at complete opposite ends of things when it comes to how we would like things to be. But we live in a society that says, you're allowed to think that way, I'm allowed to think this way, you're allowed to worship that way, I'm allowed to worship this way, or not at all, and I can peacefully assemble, and I can speak about what I don't like and what changes I want to be made. And tolerance allows for those things, right? It's the true application of liberalism is tolerance. And so these individuals then are not liberals. They're something else. I don't know what they are. And they're illiberal in those actions. And so, yeah, that's basically the thoughts that have formed as we've gone along through from the beginning.
It's interesting because a lot of people like to cite the Karl Popper's the paradox of tolerance, saying that you have to be intolerable to be able to maintain tolerance. But it's interesting because it's been a second since I've read that his writings, but he specifically talked about not just like intolerable beliefs, but when somebody's actively trying to be intolerant of others, like trying to use the power of the state to oppress somebody, then we should be intolerable of those beliefs. But when people are peacefully being intolerant, if you will, it doesn't really necessarily, it doesn't say that we should be intolerable of those beliefs. But what you have in some of these groups and administrators, as going back to CACREP, is that they think that they're seeking out intolerance by drawing some of that out, but they don't even realize that they're the ones who you are using the power of the state, of the administration, to become intolerant.
So you end up becoming that which you are trying to address, likely inadvertently. I always like to assume good faith, and I would imagine that ideally,
Right.
but even in assuming good faith, I'm 40 years old now, right? So I can think of times where I meant well, but the outcome wasn't what it should have been. And so, another question that I have, kind of going off script a little bit, beyond just social work education and into education in general, there seems to be this trend where anything that isn't that challenges the left, let's say, is assumed automatically to be on the right. How would you say we get out of that mindset of anything that's not X must be Y, anything that's not Y must be X? How do we create an environment, particularly in education, where we're both X and Y and Z and all the other letters and all the other ideologies and ideas are welcome without having to take sides?
I think I'll speak to this if you can hear me. I think the first step is to reinvigorate and reinstill the idea and the importance of civil discourse, not just in society in general, but also in our schools. I'm going to make a plug for FAIR's American Experience curriculum for K through 12 students because that's exactly what we're trying to do now.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think a lot of the misunderstanding and the division and the friction we're seeing is because we have stopped learning how to communicate, especially in person. I can recall, like, I'm in my 50s and I'm dating myself when I say there was a time that I would actually go to gatherings, holiday gatherings with friends and family, and we'd have spirited debates, whether we were Republicans, Democrats, anything in between, agnostic, Catholic, Baptist, whatever. And we spar with each other, but at the end of the day, we get up, we hug, and we'll be like, okay, great, see you next holiday. We don't do that anymore. And I'll beat a dead horse and say a lot of this is because of social media and the pandemic and lockdown and what have you. But I think it's been going on for a while that we've been slowly distancing ourselves. And I recall just viscerally that I became aware of this artificial, I call it the illusion of division, but this discourse wall when in the 2000 Bush v. Gore election, very contentious election. But it was the first time I saw that map on the TV, on the news, of the red and blue states. And when you literally categorize people as like, well, you're red and you're blue, it really puts up, if not physical walls, then metaphorical, figurative walls, and it keeps us from dialoguing. So, long way of saying, to get back to where we need to be, we have got to make it not just tolerable, but imperative that civil discourse and viewpoint diversity be respected.
Yeah. Would you mind saying more about the K through 12 education for FAIR? We're really interested in learning more about that.
Oh, okay. Well, so I will just start off by saying that I'm sure you understand or probably knowledgeable of the huge amount of polarization we're seeing in schools today. And a lot of that is born from just what's happening in the news media and current events and social justice movement, but also specific sort of curricula that's being implemented in a lot of states, including the state I think you're heading to, Zander. It's called ethnic studies, sometimes liberated ethnic studies. And it is a sort of a practice that, or an area of academic practice that originated at UC Berkeley and some other higher educational institutions. And it's sort of grounded in the oppressor-oppressed framework. but now it's being embedded largely in K through 12 public school curricula and even private school curricula. And while it's cloaked in the language of inclusion and empowerment, what it does is plant seeds of division and fragility in our students. They're still forming very formative brains, and it takes away their sense of agency, and it tends to see them as enemies based on identity group. And what we're trying to do is counter that by not whitewashing America's difficult and complex history, assimilating certain ethnic groups, but exploring how these different groups, whether it's colonial Europeans, enslaved Africans, Native Americans, new waves of immigrants from all over the world, we've all come here, various reasons and in different ways, and we are navigating that ongoing challenge of building unity from diversity, but at the same time testing, expanding, and realizing American ideals of freedom and equality. So what we've done is put together an educational experience that helps students understand what makes us different and what we share. And a critical part of that is civil discourse exercises that we built into each unit. So at the end of all of the lessons in each unit, students debate with each other, respectfully with ground rules, their different perspectives, and genuinely engage with others by steel manning, which I'm sure you know what that is, and star manning. So long story short, the end result of this curriculum is that by the end of the semester, it's one semester elective, we're preparing students to see themselves as vital parts of our ongoing American experiment in democratic pluralism.
Awesome. That sounds amazing.
We're really proud of it.
Yeah. Once we're done here, please feel free to share that link with us, and we'll include that link when we upload the podcast.
Perfect.
Yeah. That's just wonderful. At least in my opinion, you can't start early enough in understanding that my way of thinking isn't the only way of thinking. The sooner we get out of that mindset of just seeing everything through our own perspective as though our opinions are the only facts that exist, I think would be better for it. So really appreciate the work that you're doing there. Going back to social work education for just a moment, one of the questions that we had was many social work programs require students to advocate for specific political causes or political policy positions as part of their coursework and field education. How does this compare to the ideological requirements you challenged in council education programs?
I might be able to speak on that a little bit. In counseling, one of the ways that story has played out is initially there was only one license available if you wanted to be an independent practice, and that was to be a psychologist. And then in 1963, the law was changed, and at that point, psychologists started to protect their professional space in licensure, and they pushed counseling out. And that is what inspired counselors to start going out and getting their own licenses. And in order to do that, because there was also social work, and there's marriage and family therapy, and there's psychiatry, and there's psychiatric nurses, and they're all, they can all do talk therapy in their way of trying to differentiate the profession. They adopted advocacy as the hallmark of the profession. Or, to be clear, the Honor Society, Chi Sigma Iota, decided that would be the way to distinguish the profession from the other talk therapies. And what that has meant, it has changed over time. It's been, I think, for the most part, a more general sort of advocacy sort of thing, just like, you need to go find something and advocate for it. But as time has gone on, it's been more of an entrenchment into multicultural values. That started in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s. It really got locked in, and that's when the groups, including Chi Sigma Iota, which was strategically started to advance these ideas in the counseling field, and the American Counseling Association and CACREP, the accrediting body, really started to get together to solidify this singular idea of what counseling is, with the advocacy hallmark on all of those. And it's been primarily, within the various issues of how they determined multiculturalism. And if you look in the multicultural textbooks right now, it's a lot of what you see in the, farthest progressive sort of arenas. It's a focus on race and identity politics, and your sexual orientation, your what your gender is, disabilities, that sort of thing, very much in that. And at least while I was still in the graduate program, we were encouraged at times to even skip class to go to meetings where they were, kind of rebel rousing over one issue or another. We didn't have to be at that point very specific on what our issue was, but they definitely wanted that to be part of what we were doing. And having talked to several other graduate students who ended up in my situation, I have heard that in other places, they have also done the same thing. It's been, very particular, and they want counselors to, instead of go into private practice, work in situations where they are, interacting with the state rather than just interact with individuals and focus on their mental health, which is a little bit baffling. I mean, I sometimes wonder if there's a little confusion there in counseling as to whether they want to be social workers or not. I can't speak to what they're thinking, but based on results and what I experienced, there seems to be some confusion.
Yeah, Gabriel, go ahead.
One of the things that that last line that Suzannah mentioned, I think, is very accurate. There's many people who see themselves as activists first before their career or their profession. There's people who think that they want to change the world. I remember that. So I'm a law student, but in law school, a lot of the things that I read, even before that, my undergraduate is actually in social justice. So one of the things I remember in one of my classes, they talked about about some critical race theory, particularly how. One of the problems that critical race theory saw was that in order to change the law, you need a client, and to get a client, you actually have to have somebody who was okay with say losing a case to be able to appeal to the Supreme Court. Well, that can actually be very unethical, because when you're a lawyer representing a client, your priority should be the client. Sure, you can use a client as a vehicle to try to change the law if something's unfair. But what a lot of times critical theories do, they don't care about their clients. They care more about changing laws and screw their client if they have to. And that doesn't just apply to the legal profession. It applies to the counseling profession. It applies to all these other professions where they use the lives of people they're supposed to represent, they're supposed to serve, in order to push some sort of agenda. This is a pervasive problem that's been going on for the last 50 or so years.
Wow, I did not know that. So right now, would you say, some ideological conformity happening in legal education as well? And if so, what does that look like?
Oh, certainly. Monica, do you want to take this one? I feel like you can tell us a little bit more about the legal conformity in education, because we were just talking about it yesterday. In the bar and in law schools, there is a lot of that, but I think the issue really goes down to like the American Bar Association and the California Bar too.
Wow, that is interesting. I mean, I'm uneducated on law, so I do apologize for not knowing that, but I'm really interested to learn more.
Oh, yeah. I'm having trouble with my microphone. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, Gabe's right. This problem is not, confined to the social worker space. It's definitely extending into the legal profession. For example, the ABA had legal education standards, and between 2022 and 2023, FAIR challenged ABA accreditation standards that actually, if you can believe it, required law schools to demonstrate a commitment to diversity and inclusion. So what FAIR did was argue that these vague standards created de facto ideological litmus tests for law schools. And we're happy to say that our advocacy helped ensure clear standards focused on equality and of opportunity rather than prescribed ideological approaches. And more recently, it's interesting, there are two cases that FAIR was involved in. One was a West Virginia state bar case. And in that case, FAIR challenged the West Virginia bar's race-based seat reservation policies. And by that, I mean what the bar in West Virginia was doing was requiring one Board of Governors seat to be reserved specifically for Black members, and only Black members could vote for that seat. It was incredibly segregationist. I mean, imagine like just flipping black to white and how that would have appeared. So we filed a lawsuit with the Pacific Legal Foundation, and we argued that that practice, understandably, violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So that represented just our commitment to challenging racial discrimination in a legal professional organization. And more recently, FAIR joined Do No Harm and challenged an Arkansas state law that required racial quotas on professional licensing boards. That was actually occupational therapy commitment, now that I think about it. So that wasn't legal. So that's really the extent of what we've done in the legal realm.
Right.
Yeah.
So the latter example is Arkansas, you said, right?
Yeah, but you know what? Now that I think about it, I'm sorry, that actually involved, if you can believe it, yet another licensing board. If we want to get into that just briefly.
Yeah, please.
In that situation, we were contesting, I think if I can remember, yes, contesting requirements that the Occupational Therapy Committee and Board of Examiners and Counseling must include members of minority races or ethnic minorities. That was just a flat out requirement. So what we did in our complaint was argue that, again, these racial quotas violate constitutional equal protection guarantees. Now, thankfully, I'm happy to report that Governor Sanders signed a House bill, I think it was about 2 months ago or less, that finally repealed those race-based quotas for selecting individuals to serve on public boards. And we think it was a direct result of our lawsuit. We can't be sure, but we think it definitely had an impact. But again, yeah, this is again how we have consistently challenged these race-based appointments across different professional contexts, from legal accreditation boards to many others.
Interesting. So, you mentioned viewpoint diversity about 17 minutes ago or so,
Yeah.
and this is just me thinking out loud here. What if, because pushing up against the CSWE, CACREP, and other accrediting bodies, there's going to be so much opposition that victory, whatever victory looks like, is more up in the air. What if we were to approach diversity not from the perspective of erasing what has been done, but rather evolving into including what has been done, but also such and such, and that such and such might be the inclusion of viewpoint diversity, political equity, and political inclusion in all fields, not just social work, not just counselor education. So one of the things that I've been opposition that I've had is that, Nafees, based on the things that you're writing, based on the podcasts you're recording, it would appear as though you want to undo what has been done. And my response has been that it's not about undoing, it's about what's next. And that includes what has happened in the past. Now, I do believe racism exists, but at the same time, I don't believe racism exists in every corner of every place. Racism is not necessarily present in every single thing. That's just my opinion. But sometimes we're forced to say, well, either racism exists everywhere or racism exists nowhere. Where do you stand, Nafees? And that's when I'm like, I need to back out of this conversation. Gabriel, you're laughing, right? So I'm like, I'm backing out. I'm cornered. I'm out. I got to go get some coffee. But yeah, Gabriel, you want to chime in? You look like you wanted to say something to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, I think critical race theory and critical legal studies have really are to blame for trying to propagating this ideology into everything. And it's interesting because a lot of people keep saying that critical race theory and critical theory, it's just a legal doctrine, or it doesn't really extend to that. I mean, in my first year of college back in 2012, I had a class, an English class, that we were talking about critical studies, critical. We analyzed them under the feminist viewpoint, communist viewpoint, all these different things. That was in my freshman year of college and stuff. So, okay, so it's not just a graduate level course. But then going back to ninth grade, I remember when we were using, again, another English class, we were writing about school shooters. And basically we had to write a poem about like what it meant to, what a school shooter might have been thinking or something like that. I can't remember precisely what it was, but I remember the teacher told us to close our eyes and then picture a school shooter and basically like just stereotypical school shooter. And and then she would ask questions. How many people thought he was white? And a lot of people would raise their hands. How many people were wearing a suit? And that's critical theory in practice. This is not reserved for the academic. And now this is back in 2009, 8 or 9, I can't remember. I was in ninth grade. And so this has been going on for a long time. Unfortunately, it hasn't been getting the attention that it really deserves until the last, like maybe 5, maybe even less than 10 years, really. But it's something that's it's pervasive in almost all of education. And it's the only way to really combat this is by doing work like FAIR has been doing, that you got to call it out, you got to challenge it, because it really does turn into it turns from a theory into practice into discrimination. That's what critical theory is.
Yeah. So what does success look like in the next 5 to 10 years for FAIR? Like I know you talked about legal education, you talked about social work education. Obviously, we're here because of the public work with CACREP. I'm sure there are other disciplines that you're working with as well. What would success look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Oh, K through 12 education too. I forgot to mention that. You mentioned that as well.
What would success look like?
Yeah.
Well, it's really, I like to sort of back up and say that we have to be realistic with our expectations, because this problem, I think we all know this problem didn't start overnight. This problem has been decades in the making. I graduated from Harvard Law School when Derek Bell, who was one of the architects of critical race theory, when he was still teaching. And at the time, I only had just the vaguest sense of what was happening. It was just really on my periphery. And I remember distinctly having a class called Race, Racism, the Law. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever been presented with the theoretical concept that racism could only be perpetrated by certain groups. So in other words, if you're white, of course you could be racist because you had power. But if you were black or any other color, you could not be racist because you didn't have power. And it didn't make any sense to me at the time. I was in my third year of law school, second semester, ready to head out, get my career going. But I remember thinking, well, this is a fascinating theoretical discussion, but like a COVID lab for coronaviruses, I'm sure it's just going to stay here on campus, safely tucked away. It will never escape into broader society. 20 years later, 25 years later, I have a child, they're in school, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this infection is like, it's breached. We've broken protocol. So I mentioned all that to say that this is a problem that clearly started decades ago, even though many of us weren't realizing it. So if a problem has been brewing this long and is now just coming to maturation, I think we've got to be honest with the fact that it's going to take just as long, if not longer, to fix it. Okay, it's like a person who's gained weight. Like if you wake up one day and you're obese, you can't think, I'm just going to chop off an arm or a leg and I'll be done with 30 pounds. You got to do the hard work. We have to do the hard work now. That means that, and I constantly tell my friends and colleagues at FAIR and our staff, we are doing work that we may not see the results of in our lifetimes. And I know that's scary. And I know it sounds a little depressing, but it shouldn't be. It's to remind us of exactly what Martin Luther King said the night before he was assassinated. He says, I may not make it to the mountaintop with you. And he didn't. But you will get there. So what I say is, we will get there. And I'm not evading your question. You're looking for very specific, I think, like metrics and how will we know success when we see it. I think it might be very difficult to measure that quantifiably right here as we move through, slog it through year and year and year by year, day by day. I think that the true measure of how we can gauge success is going back to viewpoint diversity. When we find ourselves, even if we can't solve these problems in a very visceral, identifiable way, but when we find ourselves empowered with the freedom to even talk about these issues openly and freely, we are creating a pathway to solving them. And I remember, and I know Suzannah does too, very early on in FAIR's history, and Gabe, you might as well, there were some things we could not even begin to talk about openly. Whether it's, oh my God, why is my child being put into an affinity group when they're, black or white? Oh, wait, why is my child, my female, soccer player daughter competing with a guy? We couldn't talk about any of this. And people lived in fear. I'm happy to report now, and I think we can all see that the tide is changing and we can at least start talking about these issues. So I'm hopeful, but it's going to take a while, people.
Yeah,
it really is.
Success isn't necessarily quantitatively measurable. Qualitative measurability is certainly a thing.
Yes.
Just us being able to have these conversations. My research agenda is sports social work, and my most downloaded article is about trans athlete inclusion in sports. Yep. And it's a point counterpoint article talking about, different perspectives. So just being able to publish that and have that be downloaded and used by the NCAA has been, one, an honor, but also two, it's not something that we could have been talking about just a few years ago. So really, certainly valuable there. And indeed, what's the old saying? I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, maturity or responsibility is planting trees, the shade of which you'll never get to experience.
Yes.
I feel like FAIR is certainly doing that. So we're so appreciative of you and your organization.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the closing questions here is, so given, and going back to social work education as well for just a moment, given FAIR's successful action against CACREP and the other disciplines we talked about, what would you need to see from affected students and faculty to consider filing a parallel complaint against CSW? And I know, Suzannah, you mentioned having spoken with Arnold about that, and say what you're allowed to say. I certainly don't want to probe any more than you're allowed to say, but from a public perspective, what can you say about FAIR's next steps with CSWE?
Did you want me to take that, or
anyone?
Okay, well, I'm sure others will chime in. I will just say, to consider a parallel complaint against CSWE, this is, and you know what, Gabe, you probably want to chime in as well, but I'll start. I think what we need to see is documentation of, one, specific policies and practices that compel ideological conformity. It sounds like we have those. Two, evidence of academic penalties for students who respectfully disagree with program-related ideology, and testimonials from students who are affected and faculty who are affected describing the concrete harm. And I guess lastly, examples of how these requirements specifically create hostile educational, or environments based on these protected characteristics. So as we noted in our OCR, our complaint, we're concerned about threatening students' academic and professional futures through punitive measures for nonconformity. So that's what we're looking for, patterns showing systemic issues rather than isolated incidents. And sometimes that can be difficult to establish. And what we found, in our practice, what we found is students and faculty have been able to confidentially share their experiences through FAIR's Fair and Transparency website. So if CSWE can encourage its affected members to do that, that would be a step towards filing a complaint on their behalf with an OCR complaint. I also think I think it was April 23rd. I think that's when the executive order the executive order to reform accreditation. I may have the date wrong.
I think it was in April.
Okay, yeah. But I think that EO in itself provides some important context for potential action, as we also noted in our complaint. But Gabe, you chime in, and do you have anything else to add there?
Here's what I can say. Discrimination feels wrong. When something happens to you and you feel like, well, that doesn't make sense to me, because there's an inherent sense of justice that everybody has. It's like, why are they saying no? Because I'm like white or black or whatever. Why not? When those cases happen, you can submit it over at Fair Transparency, and you can submit where it happened, whether it be an email, where it be like a something you saw online, a posting, and then if we think that it may be something, then we can kind of guide you into seeing what more evidence that we could find. As Monica discussed, we're really looking for patterns of discrimination, because sometimes if it's just a one-off thing, it may be bad, but maybe there's no policy to be challenged because it's not really a pattern to be challenged. But just feel your gut. If you think that something's wrong, then maybe it's worth checking us out.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can add to that some of the things that I have shared with FAIR over the course of, going on 2 or 3 years now, that helped, move this process along was open letters that had been written by CACREP and, articles from the ACA regarding, dealing with your white privilege or your white privilege in the therapy room. It's entire articles about, that were very much in a racist context. And probably my biggest project was hunting down all of the CACREP accredited programs and finding the multicultural counseling textbooks for their classes. And that's a way that you can show the pattern. I'm not sure if social work has a similar sort of class. I know that the multicultural in different contexts has turned up in education degrees, like to get a teaching degree, and other branches of psychology. And so my suspicion is there probably is something like that. But once you have, when you have a spreadsheet that, you've got, over 500 different entries from all of these different universities, and you have all of the textbooks that they're using, and you can flip in through their textbook and see where they're talking about breaking up people into race, and how they're, saying in the introduction, if you have a problem with this, some people call this out as racist, but maybe it's just your worldview being challenged. You can show pretty clearly that there's something not right there. And I think that those are the kinds of things that bringing them all together in just as big a pile as you possibly can are what shows the pattern.
Awesome. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I don't want to keep you any longer than I have to. This has been such a rich conversation that went well beyond social work, and I've learned a lot, and certainly a lot more to research. My day will be full based on what I've learned here today. Any final thoughts before we go? Monica, do you want to chime in with any final thoughts?
I'm just so thankful to you for doing the work you do and for supporting the work that we do, and for having us all here today. It's said once, I think it was Hillary Rodham Clinton who said it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to keep the village running and to fix the problems in the village. So it takes the collective effort of all of us to do this work. And I'm especially grateful to Gabriel and Suzannah for joining me today at the last minute and contributing so wholeheartedly to this conversation.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you, Monica. Gabriel, do you have final thoughts that you want to share with our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, definitely check out Fair Transparency and, fairforall.org. Just see some of the other work that we're doing. Or if there's any questions that you may have, you guys can always reach out to us.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you, Gabriel. Suzannah, any final thoughts?
For me?
Yeah.
I would say that, for not just social work, but for other professions, the direction that I found myself going in is looking into licensure. Once people are out of the university, the accreditation bodies otherwise would lose power, except for that they are being inserted as a condition into licensure. And that's going to take state by state action, people working together to rein that in and to protect their states from a ideological monopoly in these different professions. That's what I've been writing about here recently. And I think that is probably among the most relevant issues for those who actually want to practice.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to keeping this conversation going, whether we like to or not. I'm sure it will continue forward. But I'm really honored to have this conversation with you, and I hope that we can continue this moving forward. And to our listeners and our viewers, we appreciate you watching and listening. This has been the Dissidents Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.